Hey there. Did you know that one of history's most celebrated figures, Alexander the Great, committed some of the most brutal war crimes ever recorded? You might be shocked by the dark side of this legendary conqueror. We all know about his victories, his genius military strategies, and the empire he built. But what if I told you that there's a side of his story that's been swept under the rug for centuries? Stick around, because we're about to reveal the gruesome truths about Alexander the Great's conquest that history has tried to hide. In this video, we're going to dig into some of the most horrifying actions of Alexander that are rarely talked about. We'll explore the massacres, the betrayals, and the shocking cruelty that Alexander showed to both his enemies and his own men. This isn't the Alexander you learned about in school. So, if you want to learn about the untold and darker side of his empire, you'll want to stay with us till the end. Trust me, you'll look at this ancient hero in a whole new light. But before we dive into the shocking details, think about the way Alexander the Great is typically portrayed. He's often remembered as a hero who conquered the known world, spreading Greek culture and building one of the largest empires in history. What we often forget, however, are the darker, more disturbing truths that lay beneath his fame. It's easy to be blinded by the legend, but we need to pull back the curtain to understand the full extent of his actions. Now, let's start by looking at Alexander the Great as we know him. He's often remembered as one of the greatest military leaders in history. He led an army that stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa, never losing a battle. He is admired for his ambition, military genius, and the spread of Greek culture. But behind that impressive image, Alexander's path to empire was filled with violence, betrayal, and horrific acts. Alexander's reign was filled with complex moments, and in many of his campaigns, he acted with an unmatched ferocity that left a trail of destruction. Though many of his actions were politically or militarily motivated, the brutality of some of his decisions crossed moral lines and shattered lives. 1. The Siege of Thebes, a brutal beginning. Let's start with one of Alexander's earliest acts of cruelty, the destruction of Thebes in 335 BC. Thebes, a powerful Greek city-state, had rebelled against Alexander's rule. In response, Alexander didn't just put down the rebellion. He made an example of the city. He ordered the complete destruction of Thebes. The city was looted, its buildings were burned to the ground, and 6,000 Theban soldiers were slaughtered. But it didn't stop there. Alexander had 30,000 Theban civilians sold into slavery. The city was reduced to rubble, and this brutal act sent a chilling message to other Greek states. Do not challenge Alexander, or you will face complete annihilation. It was an early indication of how ruthless he could be, and how far he was willing to go to secure his power. The violence in Thebes wasn't just a military victory. It was a statement. Alexander made it clear that any rebellion would not only be crushed, but would be met with such extreme brutality that it would deter others from ever considering disobedience. It wasn't about taking control. It was about instilling fear in the hearts of anyone who dared oppose him. 2. The massacre of the Malian city. Innocent lives taken. One of the most horrific episodes of Alexander's career occurred during his campaign in India, specifically in the siege of the Malian city in 325 BC. The Malians were a fiercely independent people, and they resisted Alexander's invasion. The siege was a bloody affair, but what makes it especially brutal is the massacre that followed. After the city fell, Alexander's troops slaughtered the civilians in a terrifying display of violence. Women and children were not spared, and the streets were flooded with blood. The brutality was so severe that even some of Alexander's own men were disgusted by it. They were horrified by the needless destruction of life, but Alexander's orders were clear: no mercy. But the bloodshed didn't stop there. When Alexander himself was wounded during the siege, he was carried back to his camp by his men. This injury, however, didn't soften his approach. When the battle was over, he ordered even more executions. Thousands of people were executed as a result of this siege, making it one of the bloodiest events of his entire campaign. The cruelty of this massacre became an infamous part of Alexander's Indian campaign. In fact, some of his soldiers began questioning the morality of their leader after seeing the senseless slaughter of civilians. Yet, despite their disgust, they followed him, loyal to the end. It's hard to imagine how the soldiers reconciled their heroism in battle with the brutality they witnessed in the aftermath. But Alexander's reign was one where fear and power were paramount. 3. The destruction of Persepolis, a symbolic and brutal end. Perhaps one of the most notorious acts of Alexander's reign was the destruction of Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was a magnificent city, rich in culture and history, but Alexander decided to burn to the ground in 330 BC. This wasn't just an act of war, it was an act of revenge. The Persians had destroyed Athens a century earlier, and Alexander wanted to show the world that he would not only conquer Persia, but also erase it from history. The city was set on fire, and many of its treasures were looted or destroyed. Some even believe that the destruction of Persepolis was so complete that it was meant to send a message. Persian civilization had been wiped out, and now the world belonged to Alexander. It was an act of symbolism and power. Alexander wasn't just conquering lands. He was erasing history. In his mind, he was the true successor of Greek culture, and anything Persian was to be destroyed. The burning of Persepolis also marked a significant shift in Alexander's attitude toward his empire. It went beyond conquest. It became personal. He was no longer just a general leading an army for the sake of glory. He was a ruler consumed by the desire to reshape the world in his image, regardless of the cost. For the execution of Parmenian's son, a friend turned foe. One of the most shocking betrayals that Alexander committed was the execution of his closest general's son, Philotas. Parmenion, a trusted officer who had helped Alexander conquer much of Persia, had a son named Philotas. In 330 BC, Alexander accused Philotas of plotting to assassinate him, though there was little evidence to support the claim. In an act of ruthlessness, Alexander had Philotas executed in cold blood. But it didn't stop there. To make an example of Parmenion, he had his son's body mutilated and sent to his father, along with a message. When Parmenion heard of the execution, he was horrified and protested, but soon after, he was also killed, despite his loyalty to Alexander. This was a brutal and calculated move by Alexander, showing that no one, not even his closest friends and allies, were safe if they were suspected of treason. The execution of Philotas and his father Parmenion is a chilling example of Alexander's cruelty and his complete disregard for loyalty when his power was at stake. Even those who had helped him build his empire weren't immune from his wrath if they were suspected of betrayal, and this act made it clear that Alexander trusted no one, not even his closest companions. 5. The bloodbath at the Battle of the Hydaspes, no mercy. When Alexander crossed into India, he faced King Porus in the famous Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. The battle itself was brutal, but what happened afterward was even worse. After defeating Porus, Alexander ordered the capture of Porus and his family. But instead of negotiating or showing mercy, Alexander humiliated Porus by forcing him to kneel before him. The war didn't stop with the battle. Alexander, in a move to send a message to other kings in India, decided to completely wipe out any resistance. His troops went on to slaughter countless numbers of Porus soldiers and civilians. The bloodshed left behind a trail of destruction, and the brutality of Alexander's actions during and after battle was so savage that even some of his own men began to question his methods. While some might say that Alexander's victory over Porus was a military triumph, the sheer scale of the massacre afterward showed a darker side to his leadership. Alexander's desire to conquer and dominate was absolute, and anyone who stood in his way faced annihilation. 6. The mutiny at the Bias River, the breaking point. By 326 BC, Alexander had pushed his army to its limits, marching through Persia and India. After his victory at the Hydaspes, his men, exhausted and weary of the endless wars, had finally had enough. They reached the Bias River in India and refused to go any further. In response to their mutiny, Alexander's anger flared. He threatened to execute any man who opposed his orders, showing no compassion for the soldiers who had been with him through countless battles. This moment is critical because it shows the emotional and psychological toll of Alexander's endless wars on his men. For years, they had followed him across deserts, through mountains, and into battles that seemed endless. Yet, when they reached the Bias River, they had had enough. This was the moment when Alexander's troops, once fiercely loyal, realized they had reached their breaking point. Despite this, Alexander would not relent. His single-minded ambition to conquer the world left little room for compassion or mercy. 7. Alexander's personal revenge, the killing of Clitus the Black. One of the most tragic and telling moments of Alexander's reign was the killing of Clitus the Black. Clitus was a loyal general and friend who had saved Alexander's life during the Battle of the Malian City. But over time, their relationship grew strained. During a drunken argument in 328 BC, Clitus criticized Alexander for his arrogance and for adopting Persian customs. In a fit of rage, Alexander killed Clitus with a spear. This act of violence shocked Alexander's men, as Clitus had been a hero in many battles. It showed just how volatile and temperamental Alexander could be, willing to kill even his closest companions over disagreements. The tragic murder of Clitus remains one of the most personal and brutal acts of Alexander's reign, and it reveals the darker side of the great conqueror. 8. The treatment of his own soldiers. Cruelty in the name of discipline. It wasn't just enemies and civilians who suffered under Alexander's rule. His own soldiers often faced harsh punishments and cruel discipline. During his campaigns, if any soldier was found guilty of theft or disobedience, they were punished severely, often by execution. Alexander believed that strict discipline was necessary to maintain his empire, but it came at a heavy cost. Alexander's soldiers were forced to march for years on end, sometimes with little rest, and those who failed to meet his exacting standards faced the most brutal consequences. His obsession with discipline created an atmosphere of fear and anxiety among his troops. Even when they were exhausted, hungry, and wounded, Alexander pushed them forward, showing little regard for their well-being. As we conclude this deep dive into the dark and often hidden side of Alexander the Great, we find ourselves at a crossroads in history. Alexander's empire, often hailed as one of the most impressive achievements in human history, was not built on just bravery, intelligence, and military strategy. It was built on bloodshed, brutality, and acts of unimaginable cruelty. The question we must ask ourselves is, how should we remember a figure like Alexander the Great? Should we focus on his military genius and the vast empire he created? Or should we also acknowledge the darker, more ruthless side of his reign? For centuries, historians have glorified Alexander for his military conquests and the spread of Greek culture across 3 continents. His name became synonymous with greatness, and his empire stretched from Greece to Egypt to India, an empire that had never been seen before in terms of size and ambition. But beneath the surface of his achievements lies a story that is more complicated, more nuanced, and frankly, much darker. It's the story of a man who, for all his greatness, was also capable of some of the most brutal acts in history, including massacres, betrayals, and the slaughter of thousands, if not millions, of innocent people. The destruction of Thebes, the massacre at the Malian city, the burning of Persepolis, the execution of his own generals, and the cold-blooded murder of his closest friends. These are not the actions of a noble hero. These are the actions of a man driven by a desire for power, control, and vengeance. Alexander didn't just want to conquer the world. He wanted to reshape it according to his vision, regardless of the human cost. And when we take a closer look at his reign, it becomes clear that he was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in his path to achieve that vision. We must also consider the psychological toll that his actions likely took on those who followed him. Alexander's army, made up of thousands of soldiers who had followed him through deserts, mountains, and battles, began to show signs of wear and tear. By the time they reached the Beas River in India, they had had enough. They had fought for years with little rest, watched as their comrades died in brutal battles, and endured unimaginable hardship. Yet, despite their exhaustion and desperation to return home, Alexander pushed them further, demanding more and more from them. When they finally refused to march any further, it was a sign that even the mightiest of conquerors can be undone by the fatigue and suffering of those who follow them. Alexander, however, did not show mercy. His reaction to their mutiny was ruthless, a stark reminder that he was not the man of compassion that some might claim him to be. In addition to the violence and cruelty he exhibited toward his enemies and his own men, there's also the matter of his personal vendettas. The killing of Clitus the Black is one of the most tragic and revealing moments in Alexander's reign. Clitus was not only a loyal general, but also a friend, a man who had saved Alexander's life in the past. But when Clitus dared to criticize Alexander, questioning his adoption of Persian customs, the great conqueror's temper exploded, and in a drunken rage, He killed his old friend with a spear. This moment shows us that, despite all his conquests and achievements, Alexander was still human, a man whose arrogance and pride could lead him to make horrific decisions. It wasn't about the empire, the conquest, or even strategy. It was about his personal ego. And this, more than any other act, reveals the fragile humanity behind the legend of Alexander. When we step back and reflect on these events, it's hard to ignore the complexity of Alexander's legacy. The history books have been kind to him, often focusing on his victories, his military brilliance, and his ability to unite vast lands under one empire. But in doing so, they've also ignored or downplayed the atrocities he committed along the way. The truth is that Alexander was both a hero and a villain, a conqueror who left an indelible mark on history, but not without a heavy cost. So, how should we remember Alexander the Great? Is he still the hero who led an empire from Greece to the edge of the world, spreading culture and knowledge? Or is he something darker, a man whose thirst for power blinded him to the suffering of others? The answer, of course, is somewhere in between. History is rarely black and white, and Alexander's story is a perfect example of this complexity. He was a brilliant strategist, a visionary leader, and a man capable of extraordinary feats. But he was also a ruthless ruler who was willing to destroy everything in his path to achieve his goals. His story is one of ambition, genius, and tragedy, a reminder that even the greatest figures in history have their flaws, and that greatness often comes with a price. As we study Alexander the Great, we are forced to confront these uncomfortable truths. It's easy to idolize historical figures, to see them as larger-than-life heroes who achieve greatness despite the odds. But sometimes, the truth is far more complicated. Alexander's legacy is a complex mixture of achievement and horror, brilliance and brutality, loyalty and betrayal. And while his empire was vast and his influence undeniable, the human cost of that empire is something we cannot ignore. In the end, we should remember Alexander not just for his triumphs, but for the darker side of his character that history has often overlooked or forgotten. By doing so, we get a fuller, more accurate picture of who he was, a man who shaped the world in ways few others ever have, but whose actions also left behind a trail of destruction that cannot be erased. Now, you might be wondering, what can we take away from all of this? Well, the lessons are clear. History is full of stories that are not always what they seem at first glance. It's easy to glorify those who achieve greatness, but we must be careful not to overlook the cost of that greatness. The price of empire is often paid in blood, and Alexander the Great's story is a stark reminder of that. We must also recognize that even the most revered historical figures were flawed individuals. No one is perfect, and even the most brilliant minds can make decisions that lead to devastation and suffering. If you found this video eye-opening and want to learn more about history's hidden truths, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. History isn't just about the good stuff. It's about understanding the full story, the highs and the lows. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore even more untold stories from the past.